I grew up in Bushwick during the 70s, and as a kid, it was my whole entire world. Everybody knew everybody back then, and the streets were full of us kids either playing stickball or jumping double dutch on the sidewalks. It was mostly Italians and Puerto Ricans, with a couple of black and Cuban families too, but everyone was getting along by then, and all that community tension you heard about was mostly a thing of the past. Kids of every color and creed would all hang out at the corner of the bodega, grabbing candy bars or sodas after school, and then I'd run home and be greeted by the smell of my grandma's cooking wafting out from the open kitchen window. Life was good back then. It was simple, but I remember around the time that I was 10 going on 11, things started to change. There was some kind of oil crisis over there in the Middle East, and that messed with a lot of people's money. And then when the Rheingold and F&M brewery shut down in 1976, it was like a meteor hit us. People lost their jobs, stores around the neighborhood started to close, and friends of mine had to move away from the block because their parents couldn't afford the rent anymore. Kids like me still dreamed about making it big, even as the neighborhood was starting to show cracks. But man, by the time I turned 13 in 1977, things were starting to get really rough around Brooklyn and the city as a whole. Crime was creeping in, and I remember waking up to sirens blaring outside on more than one occasion. More and more good people started to leave, not even by choice sometimes either, because some of them were getting blockbusted out of their apartments by shady real estate guys offering easy cash. And then to make things worse, the Son of Sam killings had started up again. And that rotten son of a bitch, who'd already killed a bunch of people, shot 2 kids dead in their car over in Queens, and then he wrote letters to the cops and the newspapers bragging about it. It was terrible. But me and my buddies stuck together and watched each other's backs, and back then, my best friend in the whole world was this Puerto Rican kid named Oscar. And since it was summer break, Oscar and I were hanging out almost all day, every day, and while the summer started off nice and warm, it reached 104 in the shade by July, and it was brutal. The AC in our apartment was just a fan that moved the muggy air around, so you had to go outside and bust open a fire hydrant if you wanted even a chance of keeping cool. People were already tense from the Son of Sam shootings, and then pile on all that economic pressure, and with the heat making sure that nobody was sleeping good, and the whole freaking city was getting cranky. And then one Wednesday night, July 13th to be exact, I was getting ready to walk home from Oscar's place, where the AC actually worked, when something spooked the hell out of us. Things were different back then, I guess, and my mom didn't mind if I stayed late over at Oscar's place. She worked afternoons and evenings, so she didn't even get home until about 11 and sometimes midnight. And Oscar's dad worked night shifts, so he left the apartment at about 7:30. I used to leave around 9:30 to 10 because Mom always wanted me washed up and in bed by the time she got home. But then just as I picked myself up off the living room floor, the TV suddenly flicked off, along with every single light in the apartment. At first, when the lights went off, Oscar said something along the lines of, "Oh, maybe Mom didn't pay the electric bill." But then when I looked outside, I saw all the power had gone out everywhere else too, and the only lights were those shining out from passing cars. And then it clicked. It was a blackout, just like the one back in the 60s that we'd heard so much about, meaning the entire city of New York was without electricity. Now, it was kind of exciting at first. It felt like something special was happening. We lit some candles, and then Oscar went looking for the small battery-powered radio his mom had stashed somewhere, probably for occasions just like that. And then once he found it, we tuned into WABC and then listened to George Michael, not the singer, another guy, to try to figure out what was going on. They were being powered by the generators they had over there, as were a whole bunch of other buildings, so they were able to talk to each other and relay information. And that's how we started getting advice, like turn off any appliances, and that we shouldn't use the phones, which were still working unless it was an absolute emergency. Both airports have been shut down and closed to air traffic to prevent crashes, and certain highways have been closed down too. We were all advised to stay indoors, stay safe, and wait it out. It seems crazy looking back on it, but I mean it when I say that there was this sort of block party atmosphere at first. People were coming out of their homes with flashlights, asking each other what was going on, Cars were cruising to a stop and doing the same thing. But all while kids were playing with their flashlights and people were laughing at how crazy it all was. Once we figured it was safe, Oscar and I stepped out into the street to get some fresh air. It was still pushing 80 degrees even at night, so it felt good to get out there feeling safe among Oscar's neighbors. I figured the best thing to do was to just stay put, like the radio said, so that's what I did. I was normally ready to hit the hay by around 11, but that night, the clock was coming up on midnight and I was just feeling wired. The street outside had already started to quiet down as people figured the best thing to do was just try and get some sleep. We had all the windows open and were still listening to the radio while we were wondering if we should also just try and get some sleep as well, and that's when we heard it. We heard the sound of someone yelling, and then glass breaking somewhere down the block. We got up and looked outside and saw people running around with their faces covered holding baseball bats and hammers and all sorts of stuff. And we couldn't really see them, not unless a car drove past with its high beams on, but you could sure as hell hear them as they shattered the glass on the storefronts and yelled stuff like, come on, let's go. We saw some people hauling away pieces of furniture, big bundles of clothes that they'd stolen, and even big hunks of frozen meat from where the meat market on Broadway got looted. It was all pure chaos out there. Sirens started wailing nonstop, and from every direction too, while cop cars and fire trucks raced by. But no matter how many we saw or heard, it didn't feel like there were enough of them, or like there could ever be enough of them for the job that they had at hand. It wasn't even like it was just looters anymore. There were all kinds of people down there, people drinking or people just out to break stuff just for the hell of it. I mean, it was scary to watch, almost like watching society fall apart right there in front of your eyes. And I remember we were looking down at this one group of guys, and one of them looked up and caught us staring. He yelled something about how we should have been in bed, and then he threw a glass bottle so hard it only missed us by a couple of feet. And after that, Oscar wanted us to stay inside, and I couldn't blame him. The radio was saying it too, that people in areas where there was violence should stay inside and stay away from any windows as well. We couldn't just sit there and listen to the radio, so we went up to the roof and looked up, and we saw flames licking up buildings along Broadway and other orange glows that dotted the skyline. It looked like the end of the world, honestly, and it sounded like it too. We heard gunshots echoing every now and then the sound of people screaming. The looting went on for hours too, and I later heard that a stretch of Broadway got hit hardest with like 30 blocks of stores completely gutted. After we got bored of being on the roof, Oscar and I went back downstairs, but although we tried to get some sleep in his living room with the radio on, all the noise and the smell of smoke coming from outside kept us awake. The radio was crackling with reports about looting on Myrtle, riots breaking out in Bed-Stuy, and how the cops were completely overwhelmed in both areas. I remember how the radio man's voice got louder as he announced that they were smashing up the A&P on Broadway and setting whole buildings on fire. Oscar asked if I thought that they might come our way. I tried to act cool and shrug it off, saying that I didn't know, but my heart was thumping thinking about what would happen if the mob came towards us. We'd been smelling burning for hours by the time 2:30 in the morning rolled around, but I remember there being this moment where the smells started to get really intense, like whatever was burning this time was much closer than the other fires. And that's when it got thicker, not just drifting in from down the block, but like it was coming from inside the building. And then suddenly, someone started banging on the apartment's front door so loud it seemed like they were trying to break it down. Both me and Oscar heard someone yelling "Fuego, fuego" at the top of their voice, and the panic hit us both like a damn freight train as we ran for the door, and then as we rushed out into the hallway, the air was thick with black smoke hanging in the air. We made our way to the fire escape, joining the other folks as we tried to keep as calm as possible. Oscar was right behind me, and I remember hearing him coughing as he took in a lungful of smoke. Oscar's neighbors were pouring out of their apartments, and I remember seeing one guy on the first floor hauling his mom, who could barely walk, outside towards the escape. He was yelling for her to hold her breath, and then his yells were joined by babies crying and a bunch of other yelling too. It was complete and utter chaos, easily the scariest memory of my whole childhood. But I remember how brave people were too, and how some people took control of the situation to help save lives. There was a guy Oscar knew, this Mr. Ortiz, who he later said was a cop back in the day. He was the one who led us down the fire escape with the metal groaning underneath us. I was terrified it was going to break under the weight of everyone and we'd be smushed against the alleyway concrete, but it didn't, and it held. And at one point there were so many people on the fire escape that it got clogged up as some older lady struggled to get down on the concrete below. A younger mom started to freak out, worried that her baby was going to inhale smoke, so we ended up passing it down the stairs from person to person like we were a freaking bucket brigade. And I ain't never been so scared to drop something in my whole life, and I was so scared to take it from Oscar that he had to say, "Come on, man, don't punk out." I remember that, and I took the baby, passed it on, and then got a miniature round of applause with the folks above me saying, "Attaboy, you did great, now let's get it moving down there." Now we soon got moving again as people made their way down the fire escape, but it was a mess. Everyone was yelling in Spanish and English and every kind of accent you can imagine, but we managed to get down into the alley, and then from there, we went spilling out into the streets, gasping for air. We stumbled around the corner, far enough to turn and look, and saw how flames were licking up the back of the building, and then before long, they came shooting out the front windows, orange and angry, while they ate their way up to the 3rd floor where Oscar's family lived. We watched his kitchen curtains catching as the living room where we'd played after school all went up in flames. Oscar just stood there staring before he finally said, "Everything's in there," in this voice that made him sound so much younger. And after what seems like forever, a fire truck finally showed up and then started hosing down the houses, but it was obviously too late. People were drinking water like it was champagne from a hydrant someone had cracked open and slapping each other in the back like we'd won something just by getting out. And I guess we were lucky to get out with our lives before the whole building burned down around us. But the look on Oscar's face, watching his childhood home burn, that just stuck with me. When morning came, there was still no power and the sun lit up the mess. Oscar and I had to walk all the way back to my place after the fire, to where my mom almost threw a fit because she'd heard about Oscar's block and was scared that I'd been burned to death. But we slept there for a few hours before Mom walked us back to Oscar's place to try and find his parents. Walking toward Broadway was something else, man. It was like a movie, an end-of-the-world kind of movie with glass everywhere, burned-out storefronts, and smoke still rising from spots that had only recently stopped burning. The cops were out in force by then, the National Guard too, I think, and people tried to put brave faces on, but you could see that people were broken, especially when Oscar found his mom and dad, and they burst into tears of relief at having found him. Oscar and his parents might have been reunited, but the block was gone. It turns out some idiot down the street had torched a car, and the flames jumped to the trash piled up against the building in an old tenement like Oscar's. It was dry as tinder in that heat. The lights came back on late that next night, but Bushwick wasn't the same after. It felt like something broke that could never be fixed, and as a kid, that was as scary as it was confusing. But I guess that's life. You roll with the punches, and if you're skating on thin ice, my friend, you might as well dance too. My name is Mariana, and although I live in Argentina these days, I'm from Venezuela, and I grew up there during the 2000s. My family and I lived in a district of Caracas, a place that was very loud and a lot of people very cramped together, but it also had a lot of passion, love of life, and amazing food cooked by our friends and neighbors. My father ran a small pharmacy on the corner of our street, and I didn't really realize it growing up, but that pharmacy was almost like the beating heart of our community. My father knew everyone, and I mean everyone, because everyone came into the pharmacy whenever they got sick and needed medicine. He knew all the young mothers and their babies who stopped by to pick up formula and diapers. He knew all the abuelas, too, the grandmothers and single seniors who came to him for their monthly medication. He cared for them deeply, and they cared for him, too. He gave his best advice and helped keep the community healthy year in and year out. He'd listen to their stories, recommend remedies from everything from a stubborn cough to a broken heart, and sometimes even extend credit to families who couldn't afford to pay right away. He was quiet, a kind man in his white coat who always smelled faintly of antiseptic and mints. Sometimes, before we went off to school, he'd sneak me those little candies from the counter when no one was looking. Being his daughter meant that I spent a lot of afternoons there after school, watching him dispense as much advice as he did medication. On Sundays, when the pharmacy would open late and close early, he would often take us to the beach, and that was our escape with him. Those afternoons that we'd spent at Playa El Agua or Choroni, and we'd pack our arepas stuffed with cheese and avocado, and we'd laugh as we played with our cousins until the sun dipped down low and it was time for us to go home again. And music was everywhere. Life was good, and we had a sense of possibility, like the country was alive with energy, even if it wasn't perfect. But underneath it all, things were tough, especially as the decade wore on. Around the time of my 14th birthday, Maduro changed the country's energy policy, meaning they had to squeeze the average person harder and harder. Then, inflation hit us hard, with prices skyrocketing overnight and making things which cost a few bolivares one week cost double the next. And it felt like an invisible thief was robbing us, and I remember my parents arguing at the dinner table for the first time in my life. They had to stretch their savings, and sometimes goods became so scarce that my mother had to line up for hours every morning to ensure that we got basic essentials. Poverty crept in, crime started to rise, and there were riots, there were deaths, and I remember the first time my father told me not to wander too far after dark, because the streets I played on so freely as a child were no longer safe. For my father, running the pharmacy became a battle. He was proud of it, but with the economy tanking and heavy government regulation creeping in, it became harder and harder to get certain medicines. Instead of being excited to see us and spend time with us, he'd finish the day exhausted and unhappy, telling stories of patients who couldn't afford their prescriptions anymore. He never stopped helping, slipping free samples to neighbors or staying open late for emergencies. But in 2019, something happened that meant for the first time in his life, my father considered a life outside of Venezuela. On the afternoon of March 7, 2019, at around 5 o'clock, the lights went out. All over Venezuela, from my home Caracas to the smallest town, the electricity suddenly died. We had blackouts all the time, and power usually came back on after an hour or two, but this time, it was different. The power stayed off for hours and hours, then at around 9 p.m., the government broadcasted a radio message to the people who could listen on these battery-powered devices we had. And they said that the power had been caused by the CIA and the U.S. military, who performed a sabotage attack on the Guri Dam. And next to the dam is a massive hydroelectric plant that powers most of Venezuela. But no one believed them. The power had failed just like everything else was failing because of years of neglect, no maintenance, and a system that was rotten from the inside out. We heard news reports too, and I can remember to this day how frightening they were. The hospitals were by far the worst affected because they could only afford to keep enough fuel stocked up to keep the generators running for a few hours at a time. And when they ran out, babies in incubators were at risk and surgeries halted mid-procedure. They had to rush people out into the parking lot to hook machines up to car batteries just to keep people from dying. And as you can imagine, people were understandably very angry about this and demonstrated the next day for the government to do something. They sent in riot police, but also promised that they would do something, that power would return within 24 hours. But yet again, this was nothing but a lie. Over the next few days, food rotted in fridges and the water pumps stopped, so we had no running water until the power came back on. The metro shut down, but people still had to work as best they could, so in the mornings and afternoons, the streets clogged with people walking miles home. And this dragged on for days, turning into the worst blackout we'd ever seen, with parts of the country in the dark for a full week. But the worst part was the looting. By the third day, people were getting more and more desperate, and in places like Maracaibo, it was like the end of the world. I heard a crowd of almost 1,000 people storm a shopping district, looting supermarkets and bakeries and even hardware stores. They weren't just looking for food either. They had furniture, electricals, anything they could trade for daily essentials from those hoarding supplies. People guarded their homes with whatever they had to keep looters away. Sticks, machetes, hammers, anything. Here in Caracas, it wasn't as bad, but still, on Avenida San Martin, groups broke into shops at night, smashing windows and grabbing what they could before the police showed up with tear gas. We heard gunshots echoing through the streets, and families like mine locked the metal concertina gates on their homes and shop fronts. We prayed it wouldn't spread to our block, and for the most part it didn't. But then on the fourth day, something terrible happened. Our pharmacy was on the ground floor with our apartment right above it, and they were connected by those smooth stone stairs inside. My father had always been prepared to be robbed, being that we sold medicines which actually got a high price in the black market, but never in my life had we ever been robbed or had anything stolen. And so when my father heard that a local gang was planning on targeting his store, it was proof of just how much things had truly changed. But he didn't dwell on that, not for long anyway. He just simply began his preparations. We knew we couldn't rely on the police, who were too focused on protecting the wealthier and more industrial areas of Caracas, along with government facilities which held food and clean drinking water. But the gangs knew that too. And so when my father heard that he was their latest target, he took the rumor very seriously. And he thought that they might hit us on the third night once things had started to become really bad for people, but they didn't. And yet on the fourth night at around midnight, we were all woken up to the sound of banging against the metal shutters downstairs, as 5 or 6 men worked silently to gain entry into our home. My father said they must have been rough, desperate types, probably from the barrios who were robbing to make money and not to survive, but he didn't panic. He rigged up defenses days before, so instead of losing his head, he simply put his shoes on and went to work. He grabbed this big slab of steel that he'd salvaged from an old construction site, one that he'd welded straps to create a sort of makeshift shield. He said it was heavy as hell, but he trusted it to block bullets if need be. Now he carried it to the landing on the stairs because from there he could see all the way through the pharmacy and to the shutter which kept the robbers out. It was kind of like a cage, in that there were large diamond-shaped gaps through which he could see the robbers. And so after planting his metal shield down and crouching behind it, he gave the robbers their one warning that they should leave. I remember hearing them shouting in reply, telling him to go back upstairs so they could work in peace. If he didn't, they would hurt him. And in reply, my father said only in Spanish, "So be it." My father hauled his metal shield down the rest of the stairs and planted it in the gap in the counter we used to get behind it. He then reached for something that he'd been keeping under the counter, something of his own creation. He'd mixed it up in the back room using over-the-counter stuff, ammonia from cleaning supplies, chili powder for extra burn, and some vinegar to react and create a nasty gas, all stuffed in a glass jar with a fuse from fireworks that we'd saved. And what it amounted to was a homemade tear gas bomb. And as the robbers kept hammering at the lock holding the shutters closed, my father lit the fuse, let it burn down a little, and then tossed it across the pharmacy towards the shutters. And then boom, it exploded near the robbers and surrounded them in a choking cloud that had them coughing and cursing with their eyes watering like rivers. A couple backed off right then, but the others, tougher or maybe more desperate, kept at it. And one of them fired a shot towards my father which bounced off the metal shield that he was holding. It saved his life, but he knew that it might not hold if it was weakened, and so after a second shot bounced off the thick metal surface, he began backing off to the stairs for his next phase of the plan. After my father retreated upstairs and abandoned his huge metal shield, it wasn't long before the robbers finally broke open the gate and entered the pharmacy. I remember hearing them laughing with glee when they finally got inside, and my heart was pounding. My mom and I went upstairs, locked in the bedroom, ready to climb out of the back window and jump if that gang got past my father and tried to get into the room. We could hear as the gang started ransacking the shelves below, grabbing painkillers, antibiotics, whatever they could stuff into bags, but when they were done, they still weren't satisfied. They spotted the stairs and started climbing, probably figuring that we had money or food up there, and since it was dark, they couldn't see what my father had done to the stairs. As they advanced upward, one of the robbers slipped and fell and then screamed. It was like a triple scream almost, one at the pain of the impact, and one when he realized why it had hurt so badly, and a third when he slipped and injured himself again. My father said another man tried to push past the fallen man and he too slipped and fell before screaming in agony. You see, the smooth stone stairs were covered in cooking oil, but not just oil because after dropping his shield, my father covered them both in oil and broken glass. As the group of robbers tried to retreat back down the stairs, the two men at the lead came down again as they tried to get up, and as their feet slid out from under them, they tumbled back into the others. They all went down in a pile, slipping and crashing and slicing themselves in the broken glass, so they had deep cuts on their hands and arms and legs with blood everywhere, and their screams echoed up the stairs, and since I didn't know what was going on, I was terrified. My mom, on the other hand, knew exactly what was happening, which is why she was reassuring me that everything was fine. Dad said that he looked down the stairs and he saw one guy's face gashed open and another limping with the shards in his foot, and I imagined him standing there like some warrior, shouting for them to get out or he'd do worse. But in reality, he didn't say a thing. He didn't feel triumphant because we knew how close that we'd come to potentially being murdered by these people. But we were alive, and all the robbers had done was leave empty shelves and these trails of blood. And the aftermath was a mess that I don't think I'll ever forget. The pharmacy was almost completely trashed. The shelves were empty, there was broken glass all over and bloodstains on the floor that took days to scrub away. We lost a lot of stock and were completely cleared out of any foreign medicines, which cost a lot of money to import, but that was only the half of it. My father feared the robbers would return to carry out some revenge for resisting their robbery. He said he slept with one eye open for the next few days, and even when the power came back on, he knew that we were no longer safe here in Caracas. Now, neighbors came by the next day, helping board up the door and sharing what little food they had left before it spoiled. And the whole community knew of what had happened, so everyone was very much on edge. Now, we all had heard about the number of deaths being reported at the hospitals, and we all knew my father could have been one of them, maybe even myself and my mother too. We rationed candles and batteries, boiled river water to drink, and waited. All while the air was thick with the smell of rotting garbage because the trash trucks couldn't run. It was horrible, truly horrible, and there was a bright, shining silver lining that my father was a hero. At long last, on the 14th of March, power began to return to Caracas. It was sporadic at first, with some districts getting power before others, but then slowly but surely it crept back to the towns and villages, and soon power had been completely restored. People celebrated like it was a miracle, unaware that we'd have another big blackout in late March and then another that summer in July. But on those occasions, the community came out to create a human wall blocking any potential thieves or robbers from hitting the pharmacy. It was an incredible show of community spirit, but for my father, it was too little too late. He loved his friends and neighbors. He didn't feel as if they had let him down, and we all missed them very much. But those 3 blackouts showed just how fragile our country was and how weak and selfish our leaders were. Those days changed my father. They changed me too, so that when he announced that he was going to flee the country and in the middle of the night so we could not be stripped of our possessions for illegally migrating, he found no argument from me and my mother. And as I said at the start, we've lived in Argentina ever since, and although I miss my homeland very much, I know that we will never return until there are some big, big changes. Growing up in Rio made for a wild upbringing. I was born and raised in Babylonia, which overlooks a neighborhood called Leme. Leme is a very wealthy place, but Babylonia is a favela, which roughly translates into English as slum or ghetto. While the rich lived down there in their mansions and luxury apartments, they looked up to see us living in stacked hillsides that looked like colorful puzzle pieces. But they do not look up to us, as you say in English, and we could not look down on them, even though that's all we do from our high perch above them. We are poor people, but we are rich in spirit. Football was a big part of our lives too, and while I'm sure to many of you this is an apt cliché for us, football was, and is, life. Whether it be the organized futsal, which took place on colorful concrete pitches, or the volley games the kids would play under flickering streetlights while they laughed and chased each other, football was everywhere. And since it makes us happy and happiness was everywhere too, Babylonia felt alive, full of so much joy that could light up the whole city. But let me tell you, and this is the same for all favelas and poor places across the world, things could turn dark very, very fast. The favela is a place with two governments. In the daytime, politicians and the police are in charge, and people go about their business as normal. But after the sun goes down, the police rarely visit, and the politicians are all safely back in their expensive homes, and it's then that the gangs take charge. On a bad night, you'd hear gunfire popping off like fireworks, but it could happen in the daytime too, if the police decided to raid a gang hideout or carry out some other kind of operation. Entire streets could be shut down for hours with police and gang members sniping at each other, and sometimes the fights only ended when someone died, be it a gang member or a policeman or even an innocent person caught in the crossfire. You learned early to keep your head down, trust your instincts, and never walk to different neighborhoods after sunset. But sometimes, avoiding trouble in the favelas was impossible, because even if you try to dodge it, it has a way of just finding you anyways. And to me, there is no greater example of that than the Blackout of 1999. And I remember it like it was yesterday, and I'll remember the date of March 11th until I'm old and senile. I was just a teenager back then, 14 going on 15, and it was a Thursday night, so just about as quiet and regular as a night in the favelas could be. I was at home looking after my little sister when suddenly, all the power suddenly went out. I later heard it was caused by a lightning bolt slamming into a big substation in Bauru, but that strike tripped the circuits and like dominoes, the whole grid collapsed. Generators shut down one after another. Even the massive Itaipu Dam couldn't hold it together. And suddenly the entire southern part of Brazil went pitch black. Sao Paulo, Rio, all of it, and all without warning. It was exactly 10:16 p.m. when everything went dark, and while my little brother was asleep upstairs, it was my job to watch him while my mother was at her friend's place. I went upstairs and out onto the small balcony we had, which looked over the city, and all the buildings were dark, and all the streetlights were completely out. Everything but the roads were plunged into darkness, even the traffic lights were dead. It was an amazing sight. It was exciting, but also frightening too. People called out in the confusion as candles started to flicker in windows all over the favela, and you could also hear the sound of generators starting up too, because while blackouts were a regular thing, they tended not to last very long. But this one was different, and the longer it lasted, the more the atmosphere around the neighborhood became more and more tense. Whenever anything happened like that, be it a blackout or anything else which might cause unrest, the police usually sent patrols around to keep the peace. But on that night, a whole hour went by and I didn't see a single light or siren anywhere around the favela. They were all headed either downtown or what looked to me like Barra da Tijuca, where all the high-end fashion and electrical stores were. Some people were listening to radio stations on portable radio sets thanks to the station's backup generators, and when they heard there was looting and other chaos going on all over the city, people started getting worried. Because if the police were overwhelmed, there was no telling what the gangs would do. I got scared, and I was only a kid, so I forgive myself for it, but I got so frightened that I went looking for my mom. I know I shouldn't have left my little brother alone up there in our bedroom, but that night had been really quiet up until then, so I figured that it wouldn't do any harm if I just ran over to my mom's friend's place and brought her home with me. And the streets were buzzing like a party at first. It seemed like people were laughing and cracking open beers by flashlight. Music blasted from people's radios as they danced by candlelight and battery and turning the blackout into a sort of carnival. Now, I found it reassuring because there was none of the looting or violence that I'd heard about elsewhere. But that fun didn't last, and by the time I made it to my mom's friend's place, the atmosphere in that favela had changed dramatically. When the gangs heard that all the police were all tied up downtown, guarding the commercial districts from looters smashing windows, they got together and began planning their attacks. Rival crews, the ones who had been eyeing each other for weeks, saw their chance, and no cops meant no one to stand in their way. I've been happy to see my mom, but I don't think more than 5 minutes had passed before I heard the first shots ringing out. She'd been mad at me for leaving my little brother at home and had been preparing to take me home again so he wasn't alone, but when the first bang started and we realized that they weren't some firecrackers, she said that we had to stay put. I blame my age for how foolish my thinking was, but I felt so guilty to leave my little brother alone in that blackout, with gunshots now going off, that I couldn't bear to just stay put and wait until it died down. And so I ran. And what I saw while running will stay with me for the rest of my life. As I ran, I heard automatic weapons rattling off in bursts and then the sound of the bullets echoing off the concrete walls, and it sounded like thunder as their shots lit up the night with these muzzle flashes. I saw it all as the party turned to panic, groups of guys charging down alleys, spraying bullets wildly and dropping bodies after suddenly coming across a group of rivals. Sparks flew as bullets hit metal roofs, and I heard the sound of women and children screaming as they got caught in the crossfire. I remember seeing one guy I knew from school, an older boy who was just running for cover when a burst hit him in the back, cutting him down and turning the front of his white shirt black. In another incident, I saw two gangs clashing at a corner, shooting each other with these rifles and barking at each other from behind barricades of wrecked cars. I ducked down behind a wall as bullets whizzed past and chipped the concrete near me, and I remember how the air reeked of gunpowder and how the gunshots made my shadow flash in front of me. It was all so engraved into my young mind. It felt like I was suddenly in the middle of a full-on war, with bodies piling up and the wails of the wounded mixing with the non-stop shooting of machine guns. And my heart was pounding, and I knew I should have been scared for my life, but all I could think about was my little brother, all alone in the dark of our bedroom and probably terrified. I had to get back, and in the moment I didn't care if I died trying. I remember weaving through this madness, dodging groups trading fire with rifles. Bullets zipped overhead as people crumpled like rags, and I remember tripping over someone moaning on the ground. It was hell. It's all I can really say, pure and simple. The blackout had turned our home into a war zone. And I remember stopping to take cover and suddenly hearing someone calling out to me. I turned and saw a man standing at his doorway, offering to give me shelter. And I was so scared that I couldn't say no, and I was certain that I'd be shot if I kept going, so I figured that it might be a good idea to take shelter for a few minutes and hope the shooting died down. And so I ran to the man, and he shut the door behind us. Now, he seemed all right at first. He talked calmly, said that he'd seen me around the favela and that he knew my family. He gave me some water and then patted my shoulder from behind as if to comfort me. But then I noticed how he was patting them a little too long, and when I tried to get him to stop, he started to grip tighter. She pulled me closer and one of his hands began to wander, whispering how I should relax and stay put. Now, I should make it clear that I'm a man and was a boy around this time, so this is the last thing I expected him to do. And when I realized what his real intentions were, panic hit me like a speeding truck. I shoved him off, bolted out the door into the night again, and this time with tears in my eyes as bullets flew past me. And I just ran completely blind, with my heart in my throat, dodging gunfights as gangs unloaded clips into the dark, screaming and laughing as they did. And I ran, until I finally reached my home. I burst through the door and ran upstairs to the bedroom me and my little brother shared, and there he was, huddled under a blanket, having cried so much that he'd gone quiet again, and I pulled him into a hug, and we cried together as he asked me, "Where did you go? Where did you go?" All I could say was, "I'm sorry," over and over, and hugged him as hard as I could. That night stayed with me, and as long as I live, I don't think I'll ever forget the lesson it taught me. In time of crisis, it's the children that need our protection the most, the little ones especially so, because the world is so much more frightening when you don't understand it. My name is Praya, and I live in America now, but I grew up in New Delhi in a slum, and as the name suggests, it wasn't easy. Our home was a very modest 2-bedroom home, and I shared it with my parents and my little brother, Arjun. My father worked as a rickshaw puller and suffered from severe back pain after years of pedaling through busy traffic, while my mother stitched garments in dimly lit workshops for just a few hundred rupees a week. And when times were bad, they were really bad, and my least favorite time of year was monsoon season because our home flooded with filthy water and forced us to sleep on uncomfortable elevated pallets. But there were also joys that kept my spirit alive. India is a place of many vibrant festivals, and some of my fondest childhood memories are of lighting diyas and sharing sweets with my brother. And then there were the kite battles on Independence Day where you could watch rival kites cutting each other down as these operators, we called them, either cheered in victory or cursed in defeat. We ate rice and lentils most days, and power cuts were so frequent that we joke about the electricity being so unreliable. But then came one power cut that wasn't at all funny. In fact, it terrifies me to think about it even all these years later. I was still a student back in 2012, but I also had a part-time job at a local garment factory, not the same as my mother's. At least until one day when a boy named Rajesh proposed to me. Now, he was the son of a factory supervisor, a smug older boy with a slicked-back hairstyle and a gold chain around his neck. His family lived in a proper apartment block on the edge of the slums, not quite middle class, but worlds above me and my family. I remember how he cornered me after work one evening, grinning as he asked me if I had plans to marry. When I said no, he asked to meet my father, the implication being so they could arrange my marriage to Rajesh. And when I refused to arrange the meeting, he turned nasty. He didn't shout, but he got very angry as he recommended I reconsider. And I told him to leave me alone, but he stood there in front of me, seething as he told me once more to reconsider. And I told him if he didn't leave me alone, I'd tell his father what he was doing. Rajesh said that I'd regret my decision, and then walked away so angry it looked like he was shaking. Now that was June, and then just over a month later, a large blackout hit. Now I don't know how it happened, but at around 9 p.m. the lights suddenly started stuttering and then died completely. Street lamps blinked out, fans just ceased, and the only sounds were of distant traffic and the uneasy murmur of voices wondering how long it'd continue for. Our parents were still at their night shifts, so it was just Arjun and me at home. Now he was only 10, playing with his toy cars by the glow of our only emergency lantern, and I was in the kitchen boiling water for some tea when I heard a knocking on our front door. And when I called out for them to enter, it was the brother of a friend from school, and he had some terrifying news for me. Now, Rajesh and his friends were coming to do something unspeakable to me, and he knew this because they were just minutes away and he'd heard them talking about it with his own ears. My friend's brother sprinted all the way over to us as fast as he could, and I mean it when I say that he saved my life that night. I grabbed Arjun, snuffed out the emergency lantern, and then we ran upstairs to our bedroom and barricaded the door shut with a wooden dresser that we shared. And then we waited, scared and silent, until we heard the sound of someone kicking the door open downstairs. I heard Rajesh shouting, "Find her," before people began searching downstairs. I don't know exactly how many of them there were, but there had to be at least 4 of them searching for us, so it wasn't long before they found the stairs. I heard Rajesh shouting for me to come out, and I knew our little barricade wouldn't last a second once he'd found our bedroom. I could hear him muttering about teaching me a lesson, about making me beg for that proposal. Arjun trembled beside me, clutching a small kitchen knife that he'd snatched on the way up as footsteps thudded up the stairs. I pressed a finger to my lips to keep him quiet, but every creak of the floorboards only made my fear worse and worse. They began probing the rooms as they reached the top of the stairs, and their flashlight beams were slicing through the cracks of the doors as they got closer to our hiding spot. And I remember Arjun whispering, "They're coming," and I realized the window was our only escape. It was already open, so I didn't have to risk alerting Rajesh to our presence by prying it open, but I hoisted Arjun through first and then followed, scraping my knees on the sill as I clambered out onto the flat stone roof. The night air was cold, I remember, but fear made it feel suffocating as I quietly directed Arjun to climb up onto the roof of our bedroom and out of sight of its window. Seconds after we reached it and flattened ourselves out, we heard the sound of the dresser scraping against the floor as someone pushed open our bedroom door. I heard one of them shout, "She was in here," before several of them ran for the window. I could hear them talking as they looked out of it, and then, in my infinite relief, I heard Rajesh suddenly ask, "Where is she hiding?" We didn't move. and we didn't dare speak as seconds stretched out to feel like eternity. We lay there in silent agony, and my mind raced with visions of them spotting us, dragging us down, and doing things worse than murder to us. But then thankfully, and to my indescribable relief, I suddenly heard Rajesh say, "She must be hiding outside somewhere." We heard them running off, but we didn't dare move, not until we heard the sound of our mother screaming at the sight of her ransacked home. We cried as we told her what happened, and he helped her clean up, but it took 2 whole days for power to return to all the affected areas. My father ended up going to the police, who rounded up 2 of the invaders, and they turned out to be small-time criminals with records who were recognized by our neighbors having kicked our door in after banging on it. They confessed to being hired for what was basically a scare job, but clammed up on who paid them, meaning Rajesh, and he went untouched. I saw him swaggering through the neighborhood days later, smirking as if nothing happened, and that turned out to be the only advantage. He didn't want to talk about it and try anything else because he didn't want anyone to know about not one of his failures, but 2 of them. What happened was truly horrifying and traumatic, but strangely Arjun and I grew closer from it. I was so proud of how brave he was, and I wanted to be there for him always, just like he was with me on that roof that night when Rajesh came looking for me. Sadly, our paths took us to different places in life, but I sent him money every month to ensure that he and his children have a better life than our own family did. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Go check it out. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, keep your loosh loose.